The Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and my foes, they shall stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. One thing I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of the tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now my head is lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger, you who have been my help. Do not cast me off. Do not forsake me, O God of my salvation. If my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Do not give me up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they are breathing out violence. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. The word of the Lord. This week, the Reverend Scott E. Hosey, an ordained pastor in the Christian Reformed Church of North America, mused in his blog for Calvin Seminary about how our prayers essentially function as our autobiographies. He said they tell the stories of our lives, the patterns of our thinking, and let the priorities rise to the top. Hosey says, we who are where we have been, the situations we face, the fears that nag us, and not a few of the core characteristics of who we are as individuals, all of it can and really should be detectable and on display in the way that we pray. And for the most part, I agree with him. But he goes on to say if he wonders if that same autobiographical quality applies to the prayers that we make at our dinner tables or the public prayers that we make. And on that, I disagree with him. See, I think the prayers that we say at our tables say as much about our autobiographies as any of our other prayers. And I don't know how it is at your table, but at our table, our prayers are sometimes said rather hurriedly as we mumble about how we're starving or exhausted or need to eat in a hurry so that we can get to the next meeting or practice or whatever it is we're going to next. And I'm sure that says a lot about us. Now, we most always say the same prayer at our table, so it can and does become mundane at times and even rather thoughtless. But when we have guests for dinner, I'm often reminded how special that prayer time is together as our friends and family marvel at our dedication to still say it. Since we sing our table prayer, There are occasions when we say it with great intention, especially when the whole family is home and the melody and harmonies of our voices somehow seems to work. Or when a friend is having a rough time and needs some extra prayer, we'll add a P.S. God onto the end of our regular prayer. Session members know I love P.S. prayers. But there are also times when we say our table prayers and someone's voice cracks wildly, usually mine or Philip's, and our prayer is then filled with holy laughter. And I'm sure that says a lot about us too. At least his head lifted up. In the same way, I think our public prayers, or our avoidance of them, also say more than we would like about us too. I mean, do we use flowery language that we would never use at any other time when we make public prayers? Or do we use phrases or names that we would never say in our personal prayers? Is there a casual comfort level or a sense of awe, a sense of obligation? Do we let people see aspects of our relationship with God, letting it bleed over into our relationships with them? Or do we hold everyone at an arm's length and protect ourselves and our prayers at every turn? Do we adjust our prayers to fit some sort of acceptable mold in public, or do we speak genuinely from our hearts? Do we consider prayer as private property, or is it something we're willing to share? And what does that say about our priorities? As I mentioned earlier, the lectionary this week listed only selected verses of this psalm. Now, truth be known, those selected verses include only the good parts, the parts in which the psalmist is brimming with overwhelming confidence in God, reassured of God's protection and light. And read that way, this psalm definitely matches the subheading that appears in my personal Bible that calls it a psalm of confidence. I read a different translation, and it said it was a triumphant song of confidence. But when we read the whole psalm, like we did this morning, I got to tell you, I'm not sure that subheading matches at all. It starts off strong. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The author's almost testing anyone to disagree with that. The author has confidence in that line for sure. But when read in its entirety, the psalmist seems to waver back and forth between complete assurance of God's protection and a very real fear that the psalmist is all alone, abandoned by God, with a very real possibility that he or she might suffer or even perish at the hands of an enemy. At times, it reads almost like the psalmist is begging not to be abandoned or forsaken by God. Do not give me up to the will of my adversaries. So to me, this psalm is somewhere between faith and fear, and may even swing wildly from one side to the other. And in that way, it makes me feel normal. And thank God, because sometimes I wonder. I mean, I've always been suspect of those people that we hear about for whom their faith never wavers. Those people we hear about that seem to, no matter what life throws at them, always seem assured that God has their back, and maybe their front too. Perhaps I'm just being cynical, but I think I'm being realistic. See, those kinds of stories of faith, they don't resonate with my own story of faith or the stories of other people's faith with which I am familiar, or most of the stories of faith that we read in the Bible. See, when we read in the Bible, we discover all kinds of faithful people have at times been afraid and altogether unsure if God was with them. I mean, people like Abraham and Jacob and Elizabeth and David and Naomi and Jeremiah and Isaiah and Joseph and Peter and Paul and Thomas and Mary Magdalene and Martha. Now, I'm not saying that those people who have 100% confidence in God at all times can't or don't exist. I'm just saying I have yet to meet one. However, I will say I have met a lot of people who confess, who admit that they feel bad or ashamed when they are afraid, when their faith wavers, when they're unsure if God will protect them or save them or even hear them if they cry out. And maybe that's partly because we read only selected verses. See, we often fail to take what happens between faith and fear seriously, often choosing to tell only the good parts of our stories. We want our autobiographies to make us seem like near perfect people, so we often convince ourselves that fear and faith cannot coexist, and if for some reason they do, then we must be doing something wrong. Which is why I really like this psalm read in its entirety. See, when we feel like the world is going to swallow us up, or our enemies are going to devour us, or the diagnosis will consume us, or loneliness will eat us alive, most people really do want to stand strong in their faith and be reassured that God is watching over them. But those are the same times, the exact kinds of moments that often make us the most afraid. And perhaps we learn to be disciples somewhere between our fear and our faith. In Psalm 27, there are portions that no doubt display this great faith. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. And yet, there's also this great fear, a real, tangible fear that threatens the psalmist. And while the words that the psalmist writes here may not be the same exact words that we would say if we encountered such fear in our own lives, the feeling behind them is very familiar. In this psalm, it is somewhere between faith and fear that we get a real sense of what it means to be in relationship with God. And here, that has so many facets. There is anxiety of being abandoned, especially during a time of trouble. There is a profound trust that God does indeed know us better than anyone else and will protect us. There is an admiration of God's beauty and a desire to be in that beauty, the joy and song that sometimes we cannot hold back. But there's also this raw vulnerability We feel when we completely let our guard down and allow ourselves to ask for help. There are the impatient demands that we make on God, the wondering if God is angry with us, the desperate cries we make as we bargain for God's attention, the sacrifices that we say we'll make, and the desire to learn, to be taught something different. And yet all of it in the end leads still to the admonition to wait. Wait for the Lord. The psalmist repeats it twice, perhaps convincing himself or herself or the community that in all of our varied experiences, God is there. God shows up. All we have to do is wait. Wait because we might not recognize God at first. Wait because sometimes others do need to carry us when we can't find our own strength. Wait because God's answer or response is unclear. Wait because somewhere between our faith and fear, we become disciples, letting God see all of who we are, the good parts and the not so good parts. See, the psalmist reminds us that epiphanies don't always come in the form of shining stars above mangers, or voices booming down from heaven. More often than not, epiphanies occur right here. They're discovered in the midst of our journeys, whatever those journeys may bring. Here, the author gives voice to the fullness of the heart's desire, the fullness of the heart's longings during both the ups and downs of life lived, regardless of where it falls on the spectrum between faith and fear. So while the psalmist tells us a lot about God in this reading, I don't think that's the psalmist's sole purpose. Instead, I think this psalm encourages us to honestly seek God, because it's only when we're willing to share the whole of our experiences with God that we really invite God to be part of our stories. Amen.